My grandpa was a prison guard, and he told me the horrible things he witnessed there. My grandfather was always kind of a dick. I know that's probably not the most kosher thing to say about a close family member, but I think most people who knew him, including him, would agree. He was a stone-faced man, never showed much emotion and always had a fuse about as short as the balding gray hair atop his scalp. He wore a seemingly perpetual scowl upon his face and a narrowed brow that seemed to sneer with that get-the-hell-off-my-lawn energy that only a proud boomer could properly muster. I remember one summer my family went out to visit him and my grandma, only for him to chastise my older sister for gaining a bit of weight. It of course made her cry and quickly devolved into a huge family drama that may never have been fully resolved. In stark contrast, my grandma was the most loving and kind person I've ever known, so when she passed a few years ago it really struck my whole family hard. The funeral was a sordid affair with my grandfather remaining distant the entire time, and not bothering to say a word on her behalf. The rest of the family gave eulogies and tried commemorating her the best we could, but Grandpa seemed not to notice or care either way. Once the ceremony concluded, most of the guests dispersed from the church. As the attendees thinned, I found myself alone in the pews. Grandpa was seated up at the front, and although I didn't necessarily want to talk with him, I felt as though I should. "Hey Grandpa, I'm really sorry for your loss." He turned to me, a look of spite etched upon his face. He seemed to take note of my expression and faltered into a sigh. "Thanks buddy, tough day for all of us." He dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief and swallowed hard. In that moment I saw my grandfather in a way I never had before. He was broken and vulnerable, newly alone in the world and clearly struggling to come to terms with it. I felt for him, and although we've never had the best relationship, I very much wanted to try and be there for him. Grandpa rose from his seat and approached the casket. He put a hand down upon it, speaking softly under his breath. "Don't worry darlin', I'm right behind you." Grandpa and I talked a bit more, and eventually I decided he could use some company for the night. Although he was off-putting as a person, he was family. There was also something I always found interesting about him. There was something about him that always enthralled me. Despite his cold exterior, I knew there was more to him than just mean for mean's sake. Either way, no one should have to mourn alone, and so I decided to join him for dinner. After the ceremony concluded, I left the church and went to the store and picked us up some fresh steaks, golden potatoes, and asparagus. I figured cooking him a good meal was the least I could do considering the difficult circumstances. My grandparents' old home was considerably more worn and overgrown than last I'd seen it as I pulled my car into the driveway. Of course, it was understandable considering the situation, but the difference was stark. It had been well over a decade since last I'd been out there, and although vaguely familiar, the wear and tear made it seem foreign. Grandpa welcomed me at the front door, and the two of us went into the backyard as he fired up the grill. It was a bit awkward at first, but after a beer or two we started opening up little more to one another. I told him about my life, fiancé and work, and he seemed genuinely interested in it. We talked a while as the steaks grilled, but I realize not many are reading this to hear about my fated reunion with my estranged grandfather. This is a horror sub after all, and as such it's probably best I just cut to the chase. Grandpa worked in prison rehabilitation for the entirety of his career. He began at just 18 years old as a prison guard, and eventually worked his way up to warden, which he presided as up until his retirement several years ago. I asked him which prison he worked for, but he sort of avoided the question. "Boy, that's gotta be a tough line of work, huh?" I floated the question out, and he paused to ponder it. He swished the beer in his bottle before shrugging. "You get used to it, like anything I suppose, but it'd be a lie to call it easy. Always gotta be on your toes, anticipating things to pop off at any moment. Never know what to expect really." He told me a few stories he had from his long tenure of corrections. He almost seemed overly eager to talk about them, and it made me realize he probably didn't have anyone else to tell them to. He was a bit of loner after all, and it made me feel for him that his wife and likely only real human connection in the world was now gone. The two of us ate our dinner and continued chatting about his work in the prison industry and the miasma of experiences he was subjected to there. He had plenty of light-hearted stuff about coworkers and various interactions with inmates, but his tone seemed hampered. I don't know how to explain it, but it was likely there was something else that bothered him, and I decided to try and coax it out of him. "You probably saw some messed up things there too, huh?" Grandpa sat back in thought, his pale white beard partially obscuring his disconcerted grimace. He then chuckled and clasped his hands together on his lap. "Yeah, you could say that." As I'd hoped, he then delved into a few stories about stabbings, attempted breakouts, and attacks on prison personnel. He had no shortage of rather gruesome events to recall, but of course there was one which dwarfed them all. Then there were the experiments. My interest peaked as soon as he said that. He paused then, his head slowly swiveling on his shoulders. "Experiments? Yeah, or clinical trials I suppose. They can sugarcoat them however they like, but that don't change the reality. Far as I know they never even published the findings, and I'm not surprised. He was clearly a bit reticent to divulge the details, and I didn't want to push him on it. The admission alone seemed to hang like a weight on his neck, dragging his posture down and his eyes into fog. If there is a God out there, I can understand why we never hear from him. Grandpa said he had been working at the prison for a good 2 decades when these experiments began. By then he was the lead guard on shift, and essentially second in command to the presiding warden at the time. Grandpa was summoned by the warden one day for an impromptu meeting, or so he thought. As he entered the room, he found the warden with 2 other men in his office. The 2 men were well dressed in blue suede suits with polished black wingtips. Both had neatly combed hair and beards with stark blue eyes. The warden introduced them to Grandpa as Mr. Smith and Mr. Johnson, but did not elaborate who they were or what organization they worked for. No doubt it was some government branch, but I never got confirmation either way, Grandpa explained. Apparently the 2 men had already struck a deal with the warden, and Grandpa was to be a part of it as well. They explained they were conducting an experiment to test the limits of the human psyche. They explained that all Grandpa would have to do was the same thing he'd been doing for 20 years. Guard the cells, and ensure there were no complications with the inmates. The deal came with a substantial financial bonus, one which nearly doubled Grandpa's salary that year, but of course, he knew there would be a catch. The things we do for money, he just shook his head solemnly as he said it. These experiments would go on to be known unofficially as the Seclusion Project. The idea was a simple one: take 5 prisoners and put them into solitary confinement indefinitely. Smith and Johnson's crew would monitor them and conduct research as they saw fit. The 2 men explained it was important research to determine the harmful effects on the human psyche to further understanding of the brain, but Grandpa saw through it. It was cruel, it was inhumane, and by the end it was a crime against humanity. They knew that from the beginning, but they also knew no one would speak on the behalf of those they chose. 5 inmates were chosen for the experiment. The warden claimed they volunteered for a reduced sentence, but Grandpa knew that was a lie. To put it simply, the 5 chosen were among the worst offenders currently imprisoned. Prisoner 1 was a middle-aged white male who had been convicted of multiple counts of aggravated sexual assault against minors. He'd been sentenced to 57 years and had served just 4 up to that point. Prisoner 2 was an elderly white male who had been convicted of the rape, murder and mutilation of 6 different female sex workers over the span of 9 years. He'd been given 3 life sentences, and was the longest currently incarcerated inmate in the entire prison. Prisoner 3 was a black male responsible for the stabbing murder of an elderly couple and their 7-year-old grandson as a result of a home invasion. He'd been sentenced to capital punishment, and had been on death row for almost 5 years awaiting his fate. Prisoner 4 was a middle-aged Hispanic male who had once served as a hitman for a notorious drug gang. He'd been convicted of executing 8 people and disposing of their remains during his tenure, though many believe his body count was much higher. Prisoner 5 was actually the only inmate that wasn't currently incarcerated at my grandpa's prison. He was brought in from another prison, but Grandpa was never able to get a hold of his file to see where he was transferred from or what he was actually in for. He described the guy as a young, very skinny white male with long black hair and evil eyes. Grandpa said he locked eyes with the guy once, and only once, viscerally rattled by the experience. The cells in which the participants were to be housed were in an isolated wing of the prison deep underground. Each cell had to be retrofitted with a number of augmentations which were completed by Smith and Johnson's crew. It took them almost a full year to do it, but once they were done the cells were unlike any others. Entirely soundproof from the inside, and entirely devoid of light. Cameras equipped with both infrared and night vision lens were installed upon the ceiling of each cell to monitor the occupants 24/7. Finally, the renovations were completed and the cells were ready to fulfill their grim purpose. One by one Grandpa and his team escorted the men into each of the cells. Most went quietly without a word spoken. Grandpa theorized that the men were given promises of commuting their sentences which helped ensure their compliance, but this was never confirmed. Inmate 3 talked non-stop throughout the trek to the cell, asking all manner of questions about a variety of things. Grandpa and his men just remained silent. Inmate 5 was mostly silent during the transport as well, his long dark hair covering his face the entire way. At several points Grandpa swore he heard the guy giggle under his breath. He said it sounded like a kid's laugh, and that obviously didn't make him feel any better. The guy went into his cell without protest, and as his door shut the trials had officially begun. All the lights in the block were extinguished, and the outer soundproof doors were shut. Each cell was separated far from one another to prevent the inmates from being able to communicate verbally. From there all the supervising team had to do was wait and watch. Grandpa simply went back to his duties then, checking in periodically on Smith and Johnson's team but never venturing into the cell block. The inmates were to have no contact with the outside world whatsoever, and no exposure to light of any kind. Small slots in the walls were used to distribute food and water, and the inmates were well fed with good hearty meals unlike the majority of the other inmates in the prison. Grandpa continually emphasized how uncomfortable he was with the whole thing, even from the get-go. "Why didn't you say anything?" I bit my tongue as the words left my lips, worried I would offend him. Grandpa just sighed, his shoulders slumped as his lips pursed. "It's hard to speak on behalf of those you detest, even if you know they are being wronged." There was a profound truth to his words, and it made me take pause as he added another thought. It's not an acceptable excuse, but he just trailed off there, shaking his head and sighing. After just a few days of seclusion, the inmates were already struggling quite a lot. Inmate 2 had been crying periodically, while 3 showed signs of severe paranoia. The other 3 remained mostly silent. 5 was the most unnerving, however, sitting almost entirely motionless for the entire day aside from sleeping. 4 tried to keep himself busy doing calisthenics like push-ups and sit-ups, while 1 mostly just laid around in various positions, slipping in and out of consciousness.